let's look at the election process. We're going to look at it on the American level and the federal level. We're going to look at it on the state and Missouri level. And we're going to look at, to some degrees, the districts within the state. So we're going to try to look at this process. How do we select our representatives? How do we select our senators? And how do we choose our president? We have a presidential system, not a parliamentary system, where the parliament would choose the prime minister of the executive branch. So in our system, we actually choose our president. It's a separate branch that we elect as the people every 4 years. First, we're looking at a couple maps. This is really interesting. This is the map on the right can be very misleading. And that's why I like to look at the map on the left as well. So you could see that the blue, usually when you're looking at political maps, blue represents Democrats and their mascot is kind of the donkey. It's not official, but it's the donkey whenever you look at the media or you see pictures. And the Republicans are usually represented by red, and the elephant is also the other representative of the Republican Party. So if you look at this map, you can see in the far east side was where we live. You have that little itty bitty slither is St. Louis City, if you can kind of see it all the way on the tip uh, of Missouri, right in the middle. And then I think you guys can guess what's the other little tiny area, not too big, the other county area, and that is St. Louis County. That's all of North County, South County, and West County, and South County. It's really not that big. There's 1 million people in it, and there's 300,000 people in the city. There's 1.3 million people right there. That is by far the most people in a small area anywhere in Missouri. Actually, much more than Kansas City. Kansas City is much more spread out. They have more people in their city, but the city itself is much bigger than St. Louis. And you can see Kansas City is on the west side of Missouri, and that's that blue blimp. And then anybody want to guess? What do you think the blue district is right kind of in the middle of Missouri, but relatively close to Kansas City and St. Louis? And if you guessed Columbia, Missouri, with University of Missouri, you guess right, which tends to be much more Democrat. So those are the core Democratic areas in the last election. Some of this might be changing. I don't know if you're going to see too many changes in this election. There's some talk that Rolla is becoming, which is kind of south of us, where Missouri Science and Technology Colleges is becoming more progressive, more Democrat. We'll see, though. We'll see how that plays out. Even if they make gains, though, that is a change. But I don't know if you're going to see the entire district is going to go blue, for example. So these districts have also been cut based on the counties. Now we're going to look over on the left side. That is a much more accurate kind of depiction of what Missouri looks like. So you could see that it's not either pure Republican or pure Democrat. It's actually kind of shades. You can see some areas are a little bit on the purple side, but in the end, if most people in that area vote Republican, they take the whole area. We have a winner take all system. So under a winner take all, it's whoever gets the most votes wins. And they don't even have to have a majority. They just have to have the most votes, the biggest proportion. And we'll learn about what that's called. It's called plurality. Instead of a majority, you need a plurality of votes. And you can see that Missouri is actually a lot more diverse. And our elections aren't blowouts. The Republicans do not win everything. The Democrats lose everything. But because the way districts are cut, and it's a winner-take-all system, they do much better now. And there's some argument that the state itself is becoming more conservative. And there could be many reasons. There could be people moving out of the state. There could be more conservative people moving into the state. It could be the power of the government itself is under the control of a dominant party. So the Republicans have kind of gerrymandered the districts in a way that really benefits them. Well, we're going to see. But that's the map of what it would look like if you went by counties. But unfortunately, we do not go by counties. We go by gerrymandered districts when it comes to congressional districts, and we're gonna learn that in all our state and federal level, all the districts are cut right now based on whatever political party gets to choose how the districts are cut that has the power, and that really causes some issues because there are ways, and you see in class that you can cut these districts to favor one party over another, and that's called gerrymandering. All right, So let's look at the political party candidate selection. So how do they even choose their party members? So parties decide which candidates will represent the party through a primary system or a caucus. In Missouri, we have a primary system. Actually, we have an open primary system. Open primaries mean that anyone can vote for a party candidate. Anyone. So you don't have to be a registered Democrat or Republican to vote for the Republican or the Democratic candidates, or vice versa. And what you'll find out is there's some good and bad things about this. Maybe one of the greatest things is that is really, it seems much more democratic that people could vote. But on the other side of it, people are pretty intelligent, and the parties are pretty intelligent on information, and they could do things like, okay, so we know, for example, in St. Louis City or St. Louis County, they've had a Democratic county executive for over 20 years, right? So the chances are in the next election, the Democrat's gonna win. So is it Sam Page is probably gonna win. So what you might do is, if you're a Republican in an open primary, is vote as a Democrat and go choose the most conservative candidate, which is completely allowed. So you might go for Mark Mantovani was probably a much more conservative county executive who was a Democrat who was challenging him. He did lose in the end, but he got a lot more votes, and I would tend to believe that a lot of the votes came from Republicans that knew, hey, the Republican county executive guy doesn't do well at all. Actually, he's had a lot of issues with banking and other issues. So I might as well choose the most conservative candidate, or vice versa. If you live in a very Republican area, you might vote for the most progressive of the Republicans that are running, right? Some people would say, honestly, even with the primary system in the last election, Donald Trump was actually probably considered more progressive than the other candidate. Some of the other candidates that were really conservative, like Ted Cruz, is very, very conservative. So maybe this happened that maybe there were some more liberal or Democratic people that voted for Donald Trump because they were really more concerned with Ted Cruz winning and becoming president, or vice versa. I don't know. These are always good points. Now, in a closed primary, there are plus and minuses as well. Closed primary means that only one party members can vote for a party candidate. Well, on kind of the negative side, that means that you have to be a registered Democrat or Republican to vote in states that have closed primaries. Now, Missouri, we have an open primary, so that's not how it works here. But in other states, they have closed primaries. But that also means if you're not a registered Democrat or Republican, you cannot vote in primaries. So it shuts a lot of people out of the voting process. But on the other side of it, those people that are strong Democrats or Republicans, they probably get more representation. But this could also lead, if you're thinking about it, this could also lead to having probably more progressive or more conservative candidates that are in government. Where an open primary, maybe it pushes candidates to be a little bit more on the moderate side, or to work a little bit more with the conservative or the liberal side, depending on their point of view. Now, a caucus is really interesting. A caucus is a closed meeting of selected registered party members voting and choosing the candidate. In a caucus, so it's called the Iowa caucus, is usually the very first thing we pay attention to whenever we have a presidential election. And Iowa is on the news like crazy for about a month. And what happens in their caucuses is they're registered Democrats and Republicans. They actually have to meet publicly. Like, they have to come together in a meeting. And then they have to vote confidentially in that meeting for who they think is going to be the best presidential candidate. So at first you have lots and lots of candidates going against each other, and in these closed meetings they make the decisions. Now, obviously, there's some issues there in the sense that only registered Democrats or Republicans can do this, and also you have to be a selected party member. So it's not just every Republican or every Democrat in Iowa gets to vote. They have to be chosen as delegates or representatives to go to these actual caucuses. And the Democrats have really moved away from this system. There's not too many Democratic caucuses anymore, and there's actually a push in the party to probably eliminate the caucus system. But the Republicans still have caucuses in many states, and they see that as a valid approach. Okay, so let's move on to who runs for office. Well, an incumbent are the representatives, senators, and the president who have already won. So, for example, in this election, it would be Donald Trump as the incumbent, and then the challenger is Joe Biden. Here's an interesting fact: 80 about I want to say about 85% of the time, the incumbent wins and retains their office seat and beats the challengers. 85%. So it really is a big deal when, like, for example, Cory Bush knocked off Lacey Clay in District 1 as the Democrat. And people thought that Cory Bush is like a socialist, democratic socialist, much more progressive, took out a pretty progressive Democrat, but who had been in office for 20 years. So that means uh, I think he won eight or nine times. He had won every 2 years and become the representative for District 1, which is North St. Louis, North County, and parts of Northwest County, St. Louis, like U City too. And her knocking him out was a big deal. It took her several races to actually accomplish it. She didn't beat him the first time she ran against him, but she ran this time and won. So it's really hard to knock an incumbent out. So if you had to put your money on a candidate, you're just betting or guessing who's going to win without knowing anything else, you'd probably say whoever's already in office. 85% of the time they're going to win. So if whoever's the governor right now, if they're getting challenged, they're probably going to win again. And a delegate, make sure we're clear on this term. A delegate is a representative in for a political party and usually votes for a presidential candidate at a convention. So they represent a political party, but also delegates. Remember, our founding fathers were delegates originally, representatives that were chosen by the state and weren't necessarily purely elected like a representative, but they work like a representative. So a delegate is somebody we choose to represent us at a caucus, or also when we get to we start looking at things like the presidential meetings and stuff. They will show up as well. All right. So let's look at Missouri. Missouri is cut up this way right now. This is the gerrymandering. It's actually changed. If you can see on the right, it used to have 3 districts in St. Louis. There used to be District 1, 2, and 3 used to come down the south. That is gone now. 3 is like a huge chunk of Missouri. It's really spread out. So in the last election, the Republicans had control over the gerrymandering and the cutting of the districts, and they cut St. Louis to kind of weaken the power. Well, there's plus and minuses on why the benefits of this too. So you can see that St. Louis City and County is either Democrat or Republican. 1 has been Democrat for a very, very long time. 2 has been Republican for a while, but 3 used to actually be Democrat most of the time for a very, very long time. But 3 has been spread out. It doesn't go up into St. Louis City anymore. It used to go to South St. Louis, South County, and it used to be much more Democrat and much more moderate. Now it's more rural area with a little bit of Jefferson County. And you could see 2 is actually was at 10 years ago when it was cut. In 2010, you cut the districts every 10 years. 2 was seen as a very very solid Republican district the way it was cut then. Now it's changed. Now 2 with places like Webster Groves and Kirkwood and Brentwood, and then even parts of Creve Coeur and stuff has much more progressive populations, and a lot of people that were Democrat have moved into 2 in St. Louis County a lot. So now 2 is actually up for grabs right now. We have Jill Shoup is going against Ann Wagner, the Republican, and it had been Republican for years. And Jill Shoup is in the running. She could beat her. And actually, in the last election, the incumbent, the challenger, almost won. So we'll see. Is that district going to get recut? Yes. If the Republican wins, it's probably going to stay the way it is now, or it's not going to stay the way it is now. They're probably going to cut it more to make sure that the Democrats don't ever win that district in the next 10 years. But if the Democrat wins, like Nicole Galloway becomes the governor, there's much more likely that it will stay that way. So it's competitive, that she can maybe get a Democrat to win. So that's how political these cutting these boundaries are. And when you look at the way the boundaries are cut, you could see it's just kind of crazy. 6 is ginormous. I mean, look at 6. It is ginormous. Well, what does that tell you? There's not a lot of people up there. It's if you see a huge open space, that's probably because there's not many people. So 6 and 8 are probably the least populated parts of Missouri, where you could see St. Louis City and County are really populated, and even 3 outside of St. Louis is more populated. 7 is a little bit smaller, and that's got Springfield in it. Okay, and then you have to go up to 5, and I think you guys can guess that 5 is Kansas City area, and that's a much smaller district too. But St. Louis is much more populated than even Kansas City. We have over 1 million more people in the area than Kansas City, um, even though Kansas City is actually larger. So it's really interesting how they cut. These are the federal districts, so the Congress men and women. So we have 8 representatives in Missouri as of now, and that could change. Probably not in the next census, which is now. So in 2021, we'll know if that changes. However, probably not. We lost one representative 10 years ago, not because Missouri's population went down. It's just other states' populations went up. So right now there's only 435 representatives. Okay, so how do they actually determine this stuff? Well, there's actually a clause in the Constitution called the Census Clause. And the Census Clause is very important. The Census Clause is in Article 1, which is the legislative branch of the Constitution, in Section 2. And it tells us how we're going to select our legislative branch. It says, reflects several important constitutional determination. The comparative state political power in the House would reflect comparative population, not comparative wealth. Okay? So it doesn't matter how much money you have. The comparative power will shift every 10 years to reflect the population changes. The federal tax authority would rest upon the same base. So our federal taxes are based on this as well. And Congress, not the states, would determine the manner of the conducting the census. So who's in charge? The census is literally written into the Constitution in Article 1, which is the legislative branch, and Section 2 tells us how we select the legislative branch, okay? Remember, the Constitution is just a big outline. We just follow the outline and you know where to find stuff. It's pretty easy. There's only 7 articles in the Constitution. Very small. I believe it's the smallest Constitution in the world, and it's the oldest. And what it's saying is we have to conduct a census every 10 years. And states don't run this. This is not a state thing. It's saying the federal government has to do the census and make sure it's done correctly. It's a very important thing. That's why when people don't fill out their census, it is bad news bears, because our tax base and our revenue is based on the census. So if somebody is scared and they don't trust the census and they don't fill out the form, the big consequences would be, in fact, boom, we're in trouble because now we don't know you exist. Why would the federal government give us more money for schools or more money for our libraries or our health system in the area if you don't exist? There's only 100,000 people. Really, you got 50,000 people that fill out the form. That would have been 150,000 people we would have got federal money for, and it doesn't happen. So this is big. It's not just representation too. If people don't, and trust me, people don't fill out their census, and they don't. We don't think they exist, and then we're looking at the wrong information. We're saying, oh, there's only 300,000 people in St. Louis City. I don't think that's correct. There's probably more people in St. Louis City that just don't fill out the census. And I've seen numbers like even in like North County right now, or North St. Louis, they have places where only 30% of people have filled out the census. That means that 70% of people are not getting any money or representation in that area, and it's hurting the whole community. And in areas that tend to be much more affluent, you better believe they fill out their census. If you go out to like Ladue, I'm sure everybody's filled out the census already. They might have something like 90 to 100% of people fill out their census. And what happens is the Census Department, which is separate from the government, they're supposed to have their own confidential area, so they cannot communicate with law enforcement. They can't tell the police if somebody says, I have 8 people living in my house. That might be against the city laws, but they cannot communicate with them. It's not known. It can't be shared. It can't even be, it's not supposed to be shared with the president, other than the big data, because it's so confidential. And it's so important to get accurate numbers. These determines what are also just a strong constitutional interest in accuracy. Everything is about being accurate. The Founding Fathers wanted an accurate census. I don't know if anybody knows when the first census was actually, or who started the first census, and it was the Romans. So I know that probably a lot of people that are Christian or have read parts of the Bible, they would know that the claim is that Jesus was born while Mary and Joseph were riding to Bethlehem for the census. The Romans made people in the Roman Empire come to these centralized locations and they physically counted you. And they would write things like male, female, and get the numbers so that they could delegate things just as in the way we do now, like money and how much money they need in the area or what services they needed. And the Romans did it, started this, and now we do it every 10 years in America. So what do we need to know about the 2020 census? I'm not going to do that right now, but there's a great article I could share with you guys. So what did the Supreme Court rule about the census and how this is going to work? Well, Baker versus Carr is a very important case in 1961. It said the open door to equal protections clause, so that's the 14th Amendment, to redistrict the development of a one-person, one-vote doctrine by ruling that challenges to redistricting did not raise political questions that would have federal courts for review such challenges. Okay, I'm going to make this real simple and clear. So what Baker and Carr says that every 10 years, you've got to take the census, and then you have to cut the districts based equally on the population of the state. Because the problem was, up until Baker and Carr, the states cut their own districts, right? Even though the census is done by the Census Bureau and the federal government, the states themselves determine the districts, okay? Well, Baker versus Carr says you have to make sure there is equal or balanced as you can make those districts population-wise. So everybody gets the maximum or equal representation. Under the 14th Amendment, you have equal protection under the law. You also, that's interpreted that it's a civil right. Voting is a civil right in which we should have equal representation in voting. Now, we can get into a big debate if you truly have equal representation. It's not exactly equal, and that's actually a big debate now. But this is the Supreme Court telling states, you can't cut these districts so they benefit certain groups. Because up until 1961, a lot of the districts were cut in a way that benefited rural areas. Because remember, most Americans lived in rural areas at the time of the creation of the United States, and then they start moving to cities. Well, these cities were in these districts where they had like 150,000 people in this district, but then this rural area district only had like 10,000 people. But they had equal representation in Tennessee, and one of the Baker, the mayor of the area, sued and said, you can't do that. We need to break the districts up more so that everybody gets equal representation. And this leads to the one person, one vote idea. So your vote should count as much as the next person's vote, as much as possible. But we'll get into some of the complications with that. And the next idea is Shaw versus Reno. And this is the idea that you have majority minority districts. So this is created the Voter Rights Act of 1965. So one of the issues with race was in the Constitution that a lot of people of color, like African Americans and Latinx and even Jewish people and other minorities like Indigenous Americans, they would like representatives. Well, this brings the whole question of, under Shaw versus Reno, is what about minority majority districts? So, for example, that could happen in St. Louis. If District 1, which is a predominantly black district, and Lacey Clay and Cori Bush are both black, they're still getting an African-American representative. They got a minority-majority district, meaning the minority is the actual majority. So District 1, the minority of people in America, African-Americans, are actually the majority in District 1. And under Shaw versus Reno, this idea extends to that could be a good thing. Up until Shaw versus Reno, that was a good thing, that you had these districts that had a Latinx representative, and they cut the districts in a way that helped blacks and Latinx and Jewish people. However, under Shaw versus Reno, the Supreme Court said, yeah, that is not necessarily a bad thing under the Voting Rights Act, but it can't be the only factor in creating a voting district. Okay? You can't just cut up a district based on race. There's got to be other things going into it when you're the state. And right now, Texas has been really challenged quite a bit because they're famous for really, really cutting their districts in a way where African Americans and black people and Latinx people are really caught in these groups. And they have these strange looking districts we'll look at where they cut them into these weird little strips. And that's what happened in Shaw versus Reno, where it's just like really gerrymandering and cutting the heck out of this district to make sure that it's almost all African Americans in the area are in one district. Well, that's not necessarily healthy either. And what that does is, well, yeah, they might always get an African American representative. On the other end of it, it can really result in a strong power of more white or Republican districts that have a lot more power over more minority and Democratic districts, the way they're cutting the districts. So that's the challenge now. What do we do with that? And in Texas, they said it can't. They applied Shaw versus Reno. They said you can't just cut these districts based on that most people are black. You got to spread it out in a way so that it gives equal opportunity, and goes back to Baker versus Carr, that you have one person, one vote, and it can't just be you're sectioning off all Latinx and all black and all indigenous American people or all Jewish people into one area just so they get that right.